We've all had that experience where we've been reading a book and then suddenly it starts to get light outside and it's 4 a.m. and you're working in 3 hours. And while that revelation is not a lot of fun, it does put a lot of stock in the book that you were reading. So here's a list of 7 books that have ruined my sleep. What do you need sleep for anyway? It's overrated. First up, we have Jade City by Fonda Lee. The first book in the Greenbone saga. This series is kind of like The Godfather meets fantasy. And it's so good. This is a modern day urban fantasy with Asian influences taking place on an island called Janloon. On this island there is a rare commodity called jade, which is a green gem that grants the user magical abilities. It makes the user stronger and faster and just a much more capable fighter. But the catch is there is a cap to how much you can wear. If you wear too much, you are prone to these things called the itches, which kind of erodes your sanity and turns you into a very unstable individual. And we follow several members in the Call family, who are this powerful clan who fight against the Ait family. Definitely the best part of this series is the characters we follow. Hilo, who is this young up-and-coming warrior who spends a lot of his time fighting on the streets and looking after his clan. We also have Shay, who moved away from the family because she was done with all the politicking and the maneuvering and the expectations of her place in the clan. We also have Lan, who is the current leader of the clan. And watching him struggle and really deal with some of the stress and concern of running this clan is such an interesting part of the story. And we also have Arden, who is currently being trained up in the academy to become a Greenbone warrior. It has a really interesting setting on this Asian-styled island, all the political maneuvering and all the character work. This really is one that you'll just want to not put down. And some of the twists and turns, it's good. Next on up, we have the Nevernight Chronicles. Right Way Up by J. Kristoff. Now I do talk about his other series, Empire of the Vampire, a lot, which I still highly recommend and you should definitely check out with the sequel coming out this month. However, that doesn't pull away from the fact that his Nevernight Chronicles are also terrific. This follows Mia, a young girl who's being trained up to become an assassin. If you like the school trope, this is definitely one for you. It does have Mia then going to a school and learning how to kill and brew potions and poisons. And as you can imagine, a bunch of assassins pulled together in a school. There's a lot of really interesting dynamics between the different members of the school. The world building and the magic system is really fleshed out. It feels like there's a lot of detail and depth to this world. This is partly done by footnotes, which I know puts a lot of people off because it does have this little asterisk and then some footnotes at the bottom that kind of fleshes out some of the world building. And while the first 20% seems to have quite a lot of footnotes, and I think some of the placement of the footnotes is not particularly good for pacing, after that it definitely just does a fantastic job at fleshing the world out. And I would be amiss not to mention the prose. The prose in this book, nice. Much like the footnotes, it does feel like an awful lot at the start. There's a lot of information given and a lot of things going on in the first section of the book, but stick with it because the prose and the writing style and the story, once it really kicks off, highly recommend. And in a world where the sun doesn't set, this is the perfect book to read all night. Next on up, we have Sword of Kaigen, which funnily enough is quite similar to the Greenbone saga in that it is also an Asian-inspired fantasy, and it's also revolving around this one family, in this case the Matsudas. However, tonally, this is very different. I read this more as a war epic. It really delves into some of the brutalities of war and a lot about the outcome of war. And much like the Greenbone saga, the character work is top notch. We have Misaki, who is a mother, and watching her dynamic with her kids and her husband is really interesting, and how it contrasts to her past. She used to be this great vigilante warrior, and now she's moving into motherhood and sort of this much more relaxed lifestyle, and it's kind of her battling between what could have been and what currently is. And we also follow Mamoru, who is Misaki's son. Mamoru is trying to live up to this family name, this Matsuda name. The magic system is very reminiscent of Avatar: The Last Airbender. There's a lot of elemental bending, mainly water and ice, also a bit of blood bending and also some fire bending. However, it's not called bending in the book. But the world gets flipped on its head when an exchange student comes over to the school that Mamoru is in and implies that not everything that he's heard from the government is necessarily true. This is a brutal story that really delves deep into these characters and their psyches and war, and there's a lot of different themes with grief and finding oneself. It does a really good job of carrying these really big plot points and themes, but keeping it very grounded within the character's experience. Next on up, we have Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. Now, Brandon Sanderson is a huge name, but I do think that the Skyward series sometimes gets overlooked, especially because it is more of a YA story. And I must say, when I read the first couple pages, I did have this knee-jerk reaction of, this is too youthful for me, it's not necessarily my style of writing. However, as I read on, I really fell in love with this story and Spencer as a character. For hundreds of years, humanity have been stranded on this planet, attacked by aliens called the Krell. They constantly have to send up fighters to fight back the attacking Krell. So that means a lot of the society is based on these pilots being painted as these heroes and is looked at as one of the best and most honorable places in society. It's Sanderson, so you know that the world building is going to be great, but I will say that Spencer as a character was really the thing that drew me into this story. How she deals with all this prejudice and adversity, and how she tries to overcome all the obstacles that are thrown at her, it's just fascinating and such an interesting read. I also highly recommend the audiobooks if you are into audiobooks. And with the fourth and final book dropping just recently, there's no better time than to pick up Skyward. Next on up, we have The Lies of Locke, Lamora. Now, this is one of the most unique fantasy books I have ever read. It takes place in this Venice-like setting, with lots of canals and channels running through the streets, and we follow a band of thieves as they plot different heists and cons. This book is funny, witty, smart. Some of the heists and sort of the cons are really clever. I was like, oh, I like that. And the writing style is really stylized and beautifully written. And one of the highlights to this book was definitely the dynamics and banter between this ragtag group. So if you're looking for something fun, heists, funny, smart, witty, what other adjectives is there? Atmospheric, definitely check out The Lies of Locke, Lamora. And I'm not going to say anything, but this is a good time to pick up this series, I think. I'm not going to say anything, but it could be a good time to start it. Next up, we have the series that probably has stolen the most amount of sleep from me. And that is Dungeon Crawler Carl. Now, this series, I've talked about it quite a bit, but it really has stolen the most amount of sleep from me. This is a lit RPG series with one of the most bizarre premises I have ever heard. It starts with aliens coming down to Earth and taking over the world. They crush every single structure across the world in an instant, killing billions. And the ones that are left alive are offered a choice: either roam this sort of desolate Earth planet as they mine it for resources, or enter what they call the dungeon. And you might be asking, what is the dungeon? Well, it is an alien survival TV show where humans have to work their way down these levels to survive, all the while fighting monsters and leveling up so they can then take on stronger monsters and picking up different magical items and a whole bunch of ridiculous shenanigans. And we follow Carl, who enters the dungeon with his cat, Princess Donut. Now, this series is hilarious, it's really funny, it's really out there and bizarre, but there is this really dark overstory that leans into the fact that, yeah, it's just a fun game and they're making it really wacky that lots of people are dying, but lots of people are dying. It's not funny to the people who are in the dungeon, and that's the perspective we see it from. So it has this sort of bizarre juxtaposition between this very light-hearted, silly show as these aliens are trying to make it entertaining, and this sort of brutal reality of those that are in the dungeon fighting for their lives. But it's also hilarious. It has some really crude, bizarre humor, and it's just, I love it so much. If you've not read it by now, I've talked about it enough. Go read it, okay? Go read Dungeon Crawler Carl. I don't know how else to make you read it, okay? Do it. And I highly, highly recommend the audiobooks. In my opinion, they are the best way to consume this story. The narrator, Jeff Hayes, does an amazing job doing all the different voices, and also there is some production and processing that really adds a lot to the story. You can pause the video and go buy it. I'll wait. We got it yet? And last, but most certainly not least, we have... Ooh, that's quite a big one to be talking about. Uzumaki by Junji Ito. Now this is kind of a cheat because it is a manga, and it's more of a horror manga than it is a fantasy book. However, it will definitely keep you up. It's such a weird story. And we followed this schoolgirl called Kiri, who is living in this Japanese village that is being haunted by a spiral. Now, that doesn't sound particularly weird or scary, but it really ruins spirals for you. This is really not a character-led story. It's very much a story about the spiral and about this village being afflicted with this spiral infestation. While there is through plot lines, and the last 20% of the story is all kind of collected together as the finale, a lot of the chapters are very episodic. And some of them can be really weird. There's some really weird chapters in this. To the point where it's kind of funny how bizarre and horrific some of the scenes are. But with this sort of episodic structure, it does lean into this, oh, I'll just read one more chapter. Oh, I'll just read one more chapter. Oh, I'll just read one more chapter. And it can take you far into the night, and then you'll be lying in bed thinking about spirals, not being able to sleep. So if you don't want to sleep, Uzumaki, great pick. And that'll do it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know, what was the last book that kept you up into the late hours of the morning? I would also like to recommend Harbinger of Justice that I wrote. I think it's pretty good. It certainly kept me up during the night. And a huge thank you to my patrons who keep this channel alive. Over there is bonus videos, writing snippets of whatever I'm working on, and you also get to pick what books and then vote on what we read for the monthly book club. So thank you again, your support is huge. But thank you very much for watching. Outro.